Ladies and gentlemen, dear audience from Amsterdam, Frankfurt, London, Paris, what a privilege to address all of you with these modern technology. Really thank you, all of you, for speaking places, to invite me to address this very small topic, how to combine EU subsidiarity principle with the need for strengthened European political integration. I noticed that you didn't suggest that I should discuss economic or financial integration. Let me first recall how much the subsidiarity principle was introduced in a political and institutional dialogue on the future of the European Community in the late 80s by Jacques Delors, with one concern, which was to move forward a more federalist Europe. It was meant to ensure in the end the respect of sovereignty entrenched in the EU law with the Maastricht Treaty, but to allow a move forward. And to start, maybe I would like just to tell you a little anecdote. Once Klaus Hensch, as President of the European Parliament, was visiting Paris at a time where Philippe Séguin was chairing the National Assembly. For those who don't remember, he was a strong opponent to the Maastricht Treaty because it was going to be a much too strong political integration biased. And both of them had a very, very exciting discussion about subsidiarity. And the conclusion that Klaus Hensch made was for me a real driver that I always recall, that subsidiarity can only exist if you're ready to allow the top level to get some power in a shared manner. And so you can always look at subsidiarity from both sides, coming from the top to the down or from the bottom to the top. But the only question in the end, the arbiter should be, where is it going to be the most efficient dealt with? Of course, we have definition about what should be exclusive competence, and somehow for the item that we are concerned about, there's one very strong exclusive competence, which is about monetary policy. So you could imagine with this driver, you could live with a reasonable concept of subsidiarity and efficiency. Of course, as you know, it was in the end, this concept was introduced in the treaty, but I'm not so sure everybody remember that when the protocol on subsidiarity was introduced in the treaty, it was introduced with another word that is now very much in fashion, which is proportionality. So the protocol is about subsidiarity and proportionality. And because of this, national parliaments can oppose an initiative by the Commission. This is the famous yellow card, where you have 8 weeks, where a third of national parliament can oppose a proposal, and then the Commission has to modify or review its proposal. Interestingly enough, this proposal was never used because of proportionality, and I don't want to give any idea to anybody, of course, to use it. It was only launched 3 times, in 2012 about collective action, 2013 about European prosecutor, and 2016 about posting workers directive. So you can see it was never addressed because of financial markets. So maybe that's a good news. So that it means you have a good ground to imagine that subsidiarity is not the best driver when it comes to financial markets. Nevertheless, this principle of subsidiarity should also be combined with the one that is in the heart of the mandate by the Commission, which is about the general European interests. And this is where sometimes you have some strong discussion in the Council, where obviously the driving line is not so easy to define. What I understand is that when we are here confronted with a political problem, where, to my understanding, we should definitely move from more subsidiarity to more integration, just for 2 reasons. Because non-cooperative policy making this means the statu quo, has resulted worse than the alternative. And second, agreement to cooperate without centralization are not credible. There are many credible examples for this. The first one, of course, is about taxation, where you can see that unanimity in the Council, and unanimity is the best tools against a stronger integration, of course. You can see that it has been an obstacle to address tax evasion, tax avoidance, and sometimes agreement with multinational to lower tax in exchange of implementation, diminishing revenue of member states. But of course, I would like to take 1 minute or two about the topic we are now discussing, which is about financial market and integration of financial market. As you know, my last report in the European Parliament after 25 years in a very exciting and incredible mandate that unfortunately not enough citizens do understand what it is about, because it's about changing their life and making it easier. I go back to my subject. So this last report was about the review of the European Supervision Authority, the famous ESAs. And I've been confronted with such a contradiction that I need to disclose it. The mere reason for this proposal for a reform by the Commission was a pure logic understanding of what is a CMU. If you want to have a capital market union, you need to have an integrated supervision. That's crystal clear. Any academics will tell you this. Any normal observer of the market would tell this. And on top of this, we had the experience that with the banking union, when we did the Lamfalussy strategy without doing the supervision strategy in the same place, we had a problem in the end. So let's not repeat this default. And I have to admit, those of you who know me, I've been fighting quite a lot to make sure to achieve as much as I could. But in the end, I was blocked by member states telling me that their hand on the heart, they wanted deeply to increase the capacity of the capital market union. They really wanted a truly fledged, integrated, cross-border capital market union, but that the ESA needed to remain member state-driven institution. And we've seen the result of this. It has a name. It's called Danske Bank. Danske Bank was decided by EBA, by the Board of Supervisors of EBA, 2 days after the conclusion of the negotiation on the review of the ESAs. They had a clear opportunity to demonstrate that they had been right to incentivize their member state not to give an inch on their power. And they went against all the expertise and the demonstration they had received in a report. I thought that following the rapport de force, it would be very difficult in the next Commission to reopen the governance of the ESA. But now, after what has happened in the Board of Supervisors of EBA, where I understand only one member state thought it should be a sanction, the gameplay among member states is going on, and it goes against the interest of the European citizen, because the interest of the citizen is, in the end, to have a capital market union that does work, and that is not only for the bankers that we do need this capital market union. It's also to make sure that we have a better financing of the union. In the end, if we don't do it, we go too late, too little, and we give ground and food for those who oppose the European project, because we are not able to realize the target we have defined for our people. So please stand strong and move from a fully fledged understood subsidiarity to well-applied integration. I wish you a good debate.
Right, I think we're back to London. Welcome to the second local session. I'm Simon Glendinning. I'm the head of the European Institute here and delighted to be a co-host of this great event today. I have with me, I'll come back to why I say this, a sort of economist, a sort of political scientist. So I thought it was right that we have a sort of philosopher to make this PPE event. And I want to begin as a philosopher with two propositions from someone who I think was perhaps the greatest early thinker of European Union, Immanuel Kant, writing in the 1780s and 90s, projecting what he called a great political body without precedent in the past emerging in our continent. But he had two things to say which showed something about the character of that union which he thought would be irreducible, ineliminable. Two tendencies inside it. The first, a tendency, he says, for each state to see its own majesty precisely in not having to submit to any external constraint. And the second, a tendency for every political body with power to seek to extend its rule and to increase its range of domination. So you have two forces at work inside European politics which ultimately can't be eliminated. They have to be worked with. One, a force of dispersion, petty nationalisms of all sorts, populisms in national states, and on the other hand, forces of centralisation, where there's a accrual of power at the centre. This is not to be misunderstood as it were, disintegration or integration. We just have two distinct forces of dispersion and centralisation. European politics takes place in the space of that instability. And so the question we can always ask, or must always ask, is can it be stabilised? And not, Kant would say, by one of these forces winning out over the other, the force of centralisation over dispersion or the force of dispersion over centralisation. Not one force winning out over the other, nor a kind of resolution of the contradiction, as it were, a Hegelian or Marxist might think, in some kind of third form or third term in which that contradiction is radically resolved. No, an ongoing effort at stabilising instability, something that some people have called sailing on the Rubicon. It's not crossing or remaining on one side of the Rubicon, but sailing on the Rubicon. That's Calypso Nicolaides in Oxford. So stabilised instability. Well, I said we've got a sort of economist and a sort of political scientist, but Stefan is by title a professor of political economy, so not just an economist. And Simon, I think, is by disposition sceptical about the idea of political science, especially as a predictive science, or indeed as a purely political science that, as it were, takes no account of economic conditions and so on. So we have these two people, a sort of economist, a sort of political scientist, and we're going to take one of our questions for this session centrally, and then I'm going to give an opportunity for each one of them to speak to something closer to their own concerns, and then we're going to open up for some discussion. So the question we're going to take is actually the fourth on the list on the agenda. Can we strengthen political integration in times of renationalisation? I want to take this first, not least because it raises questions about what integration should look like if it's not going to look like centralisation, right? What does a properly integrated Europe that stabilises its instability look like? So that we're looking, I think, more at a united Europe of states rather than a federal state model. But also how economics must be alive to politics and politics alive to the economics. So can we strengthen political integration in times of renationalisation? We'll take this first, and perhaps we'll start, Simon.
Thanks very much, Simon, and thanks very much for being here. For those of you who don't know me, I've been teaching and researching EU politics for about 25 years. Here and on the continent in different places. And I've long been an observer of this process of European integration and thought that what I find fascinating about it, and it builds on exactly what Simon was saying about what political philosophers think, is this tension between an economic logic which is pushing for bigger and bigger markets, and meaning, you know, you want more economies of scale, you want more liberalisation of goods, services, capital and labour, and in a sense that's a global phenomenon, but also it's a local, regional phenomenon. And that often runs at odds with a political logic which points in the opposite direction, which is that people want decisions closer and closer to themselves. They want to make local decisions. They want more homogeneous, meaning policy or at least political preference homogeneity, if not ethnic homogeneity, in their local community to make decisions with like-minded people. And you can see this tension between an economic logic for a bigger and bigger polity and a political logic for a more and more localized of decisions. And you can see at each of the stages of European integration, in a sense, a particular constitutional equilibrium that emerges. So the most recent equilibrium we can think of is the single market plus economic and monetary union. And you can see this as it's a unique, clever architectural design that says that we create and regulate a market on a continental scale from Brussels. So it's about creating markets, regulating the movement of goods, services, capital and labour, but largely taxing and spending and almost everything else in policy terms is left locally to member states or even within member states at the federal level. And that was an equilibrium. We thought that was equilibrium if you think Single European Act plus Maastricht Treaty plus Lisbon, and you can look back and read political economists, political scientists saying, we've done it. We've created this architecture. It's now a stable architecture. It's a clever architecture. It's Europe's version of this architecture for governing a continental scale polity, in contrast to an American version of an architecture they've got for governing an American continental scale polity, which has some similarities but also some differences, and also has to come to terms with that tension between centralization between markets wanting bigger and bigger continental scale economies and politics wanting smaller and more local decisions. And we thought that equilibrium was stable. And then we had the financial crisis and the refugee crisis and growing support for populist parties and a re-emergence of nationalism and national identity. And I was reading a recent research paper showing that there's growing correlation between people's national identity and their attitudes towards European integration. That didn't used to be the case. That correlation had been declining for much of the 90s, and now it's growing very much again. So the people are mobilizing around the question of European integration, relating much more to national identity rather than their economic preferences, for example. And so we now have a shock to this equilibrium, and this is where I think a classic answer of the European political establishment is to look to the treaties and look to principles like subsidiarity and proportionality and say we can use these quasi-legal principles to think about how we would respond in designing a new architecture. We'd think about subsidiarity, saying what level should we most efficiently make decisions. So we should most efficiently make refugee decisions centrally, and we should burden share refugees. We should most efficiently make security policy centrally, and therefore we should have a European army, and we should most efficiently have Eurozone bonds as the basic building block of how you can provide a more stable architecture for the Eurozone. As a political scientist, I find it problematic applying these quasi-legal logic to these essentially what are fundamentally political with a capital P decisions. And I think when you look back at various different equilibria in the process of European integration, they were all created as political grand bargains. So the design was a political grand bargain. We can go back to the 50s, and the grand bargain was coal and steel integration in return for the common market. You go back to the 80s, and the grand bargain was creating the single market in return for doubling structural funds, common European rules on environment standards and social standards. So I think we need to be thinking in terms of what's the new grand bargain? What is it going to be? In return for then creating new political integration in areas like economic and monetary union, macroeconomic policy, security policy, refugee policies. In return for that, what are you giving back in return? What is the response of that grand bargain? And I don't think there's enough creative thinking about that. And I've written in the past about there should perhaps be more flexibility within the single market. It's almost heresy to say this, in that the EU and the European single market is actually far more integrated and harmonized than, say, the market in the United States. And I'll give you an example for the services market. So the services market, there was an attempt to create, in the Services Directive, to apply the principle of mutual recognition to the services sector, and it failed. And it got a reputation as known as the Frankenstein Directive, or named after Bolkestein, who was the commissioner who was promoting it. And we got all the stories about the Polish plumbers undermining the French plumbers, and so it basically came to nothing. But it was an attempt to liberalize the services economy, to generate growth in the services sector. Why not be much more flexible with this? Why not allow bilateral mutual recognition between member states, which is exactly actually how it works in the United States. You have bilateral mutual recognition of services regulations and services rules between states in the United States. So my wife is a New Yorker, and she, when we moved to California, she's as a New Yorker, she's only able to live in California without passing a driving test for 14 days. And California only recognizes driving licenses from California, Arizona, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington, and doesn't recognize driving licenses from New York. She may as well be from the moon. So, you know, and that's a reflection of this bilateral mutual. So why not allow Germany and Austria to have an architecture to mutually recognize each other's service providers? Or why not allow Iberia, Spain and Portugal, or the Benelux, or Scandinavia, or the Visegrad states? Much more flexibility. So in return for perhaps political integration in some areas, allow much more flexibility and much more choice, much more freedom for member states in some other elements of the design. So.
Excellent, thank you. Very interesting there, Simon's emphasis initially there on the drivers of centralisation are often economic, that we see that efficiencies at the level of the economy often put a veil over political difficulties and consequences, and that they have to be looked at simultaneously. Of course, there are also political drivers towards centralisation too, but I think, and obviously they're the ones that in Britain often get the most press, but they're perhaps less forceful insofar as they're primarily political with a big P, and that it is economics which tends to be the major player in integrative processes. So, Stefan, how would you like to see strengthening political integration at this point?
Well, I actually think that the question as it has been posed, not just by you, but by pretty much everyone, is wrong. Because it is a dichotomy between centralization and decentralization. And as an economist, I'm very much concerned by externalities. And the decision-making on different levels has externalities to a different degree, to a different extent. So that, for example, the decision of building a kindergarten in Hackney is absolutely irrelevant for the decision of kindergartens in Uppsala. So from that point of view, let's look at the externalities. And let me tell you a story, because that has been the kind of turning point in my whole understanding of Europe. In the 1990s, I was very engaged with the creation of the euro. Then I moved to the German Treasury, and I was in charge of the European economy, macroeconomics, and all that. So I was in the meetings of Eurogroup and ECOFIN and all that, and I saw how that works. I also was in charge of the interministerial coordination of the German government for the ECOFIN meetings. Now, when Simon speaks about Kant and each state should not want to be subject to external pressures, but of course dominate the others, you know, that's the German tradition, I guess, then we talk about states, and we haven't got a clue what a state is. Sorry, I think most of your colleagues in political science talk about states, and they have never been a state. Now, I was in charge of being the German state. I had to coordinate the interministerial thing. So we have the usual meeting before the ECOFIN, and we concertate the opinions to the agenda of the ECOFIN coming from the Commission. That's all the Commission does at that point. And we go through the agenda, and there are different members from the different ministries. And one of the items was the directive proposed by the European Commission against money laundering, which is a good thing. Everyone would agree that money laundering is not something we should have, and therefore we need a directive how to fight it. So I look at the agenda, I say, I guess money laundering, no objection. Ha! There are two guys from the Ministry of Interior and from the Ministry of Justice. So you cannot agree to the money laundering directive. So naively, as an economist, I say, why not? And they say, because we are at this moment doing a reform of the German juridical system where we need the support of the German Chamber of Lawyers. And we all know that the lawyers earn their money by money laundering. Therefore, if you are saying yes to this, we will have them on our back and don't get their support. That is the state, okay? Now, we fly to Brussels, we brief the minister and say, money laundering, you have to say no. He said, why? He said, because the lawyers earn money by money laundering. He says, oh. Then he goes into the ECOFIN. There, the chairman was Fabius at the time, says, okay, money laundering, I guess everyone can agree. Comes the German minister and says, no, no, I cannot. Mais Hans, comment tu peux pas? Now our Hans has a problem. So he started to say, well, it's because of the relationship between the client and the lawyer and the state and this and that. Nobody understands. So the Dutch minister says, sorry, Hans, I didn't get it. So he starts again, well, this and that and this and this. No answer. Then the Danish minister says again, sorry, can you put this clear? And now Hans has an illuminating thought. And he says, it's because of the Third Reich. Because in the Third Reich, the state intervened in the relationship between lawyers and their clients, and therefore we can, everyone says, of course, the Third Reich. That's why we can't have the directive on money laundering. Now, this is how European politics and the rule of the state and intergovernmentalism works in reality every day. Now, probably it works in all states like this. But I rather deal with one European Chamber of Lawyers that is earning money with money laundering than with 27. Because with these 27, there's always someone who has just at one moment an internal reason why they cannot agree with the others. And so out of this, I have then resigned. My last memo to the minister, my last memo of the minister was the initial germ for what was a book that I wrote then when I became professor here at the LSE called The European Republic, where I explained the whole, how should I say, dynamic between levels of externalities. And externalities are public goods. So, in fact, what we really should look at is what are these public goods and how do they affect people? The res publica, the public good, is that. How are we collectively affected by certain decisions? And there are things that are European-wide and they need to be governed European-wide, and there are others that are of much less external effect, and that should be a lower level. Now, that kind of model I think. I haven't succeeded very much with the real world, I admit. But nevertheless, logically, I think it is an enterprise that actually would make us much more efficient in terms of policy making.
Thanks very much. Actually, Cantu is obviously a disaster. Also thought that, logically speaking, your kind of solution was ideal. But unfortunately, he also thought it was impossible. And I think he may be right about that. Also, just so that my students don't feel too concerned, I do actually know what a state is. But I also accept that since at least the 1930s, we've reached a period in which we've come to an end of a time in which politics could be localized. And that's why these questions are so sort of unavoidable for us. And what you're calling the levels, the different kinds of externalities, is in a way quite helpful for thinking through problems that arise in those real conditions. So anyway, that's a good start. And I want no. You can come back in your own answer to the next question, because I'm going to now, because time is quite short, move on to ask a question which to each of our panelists, which belongs closely to their own understanding of where we're going and what we might do and so on. Simon's is perhaps a little more analytical than merely political economic, but we'll get to that. Simon, I was hoping perhaps I could ask you to say a little bit about how you see the European Parliament working in this sort of coordinating construction that we're talking about, and also how you see it developing through the elections that we're about to participate in, or not.
Yeah, so, I mean, the real dilemma for the European Parliament is, on the one hand, the European Parliament, as its powers have increased, has actually, I think, had a significantly positive impact on the operation of the way the EU has worked. It's been an important check against the member states in some significant areas and against the Commission. I think it's proven itself to be a very effective legislative scrutiny and legislative policy-making body. I think, to the surprise, if you go back and read about the response to the co-decision procedure as it was set in the Maastricht Treaty, there was a general fear amongst lawyers and amongst a lot of the political class across Europe that, oh my God, the European Parliament, who are these MEPs? They don't know what they're doing. This is going to be a disaster for Europe. They're going to be grandstanding on every small little issue. In fact, the opposite has happened. I think actually the quality of legislation has increased as a result of involving the European Parliament. And that's not just to say the MEPs are excellent at what they do. They are, on average. It's to do with the fact that once you involve a parliamentary body in the legislative process, there's many more access opportunities for interests that could potentially be negatively or positively affected by the legislative process. And so it's actually been a very effective vehicle for allowing an aggregation of all types of interests at all levels across Europe, rather than it all being just channeled through the Council. And it's done it in a very efficient and very effective way, and has allowed for the significant increase in the quality of legislation in terms of the governance of the single market. And it's no coincidence, I think, that a lot of the European regulatory standards have now become global standards across the world, because just purely the quality of what they do in terms of how they regulate markets, they generally get it right. And I think that's largely not just... and I worked as a lobbyist in London before doing my PhD in the building of the single market for a lobby group in London. And what we noticed back then was the member states were purely interested, of course, in their interests of their own markets. But they often missed a lot of stuff because they were captured by one or two local, very big interest groups. And they missed a lot of other things that also affected their markets. And the European Parliament provided channels through which these other interests could get access to the policy-making process. So on the one hand, you see the European Parliament and the increasing powers of the European Parliament, I think, really having a very positive impact in terms of the quality of decision-making in Brussels, the quality of policy-making outcomes, and so on. On the other side, though, the European Parliament as a legitimising body for the EU has been an absolute failure. And so we go back to 79 and we think about the optimism of let's introduce pan-European elections, the first experiment in pan-European democracy, the optimism of people at the time to say this will usher in European-wide parties, it'll usher in a mandate for European governance, it'll usher in choices over the different direction of European policy. That has not happened. European Parliament elections have really been a terrible failure. We still can't figure out why that is. I think the main explanation of why that is to do with the fact that most national politicians, national media, national citizens still see national elections as the main political context and contest for power, and these European elections are fought in the shadow of that contest. And so that's a very difficult dynamic to break. The Spitzenkandidat in 2014 was an effort to try and break that dynamic. And it worked actually more than my strong prior was, that it was going to be a complete failure. It wasn't a complete failure. But I think we're now seeing real challenge to it this time round, with really significant figures in Europe opposed to it. Macron totally opposed to it. And we're seeing openly political leaders across Europe saying, well, we'll just ignore the Spitzenkandidat process. So we're stuck now in, again, this difficult dilemma of the European Parliament actually being a very effective institution, a very positive institution on the one hand, but not having the legitimacy it needed or we expected it to be from 1979.
So, although you don't want to see political science as particularly predictive, what do you see as sort of maybe some of the more dramatic changes that we might see?
Well, what's interesting is there was a nice piece about 10 or 15 years ago by George Sebelius, an American, or a Greek guy who's in the United States who studies EU politics, and he wrote a piece, a theoretical piece about increasing powers of the European Parliament and what the consequences might be with its different models. And one of his scenarios was that the European Parliament does actually become representative of the citizens. If it does become representative of the citizens, it will become a brake on European integration. And he predicted that. Right. And you might say that these elections coming up in week after next could usher in the European Parliament as a representative of significant representative of anti-European or anti-integrationist type sentiment. Right. And so for the first time we could see the European Parliament more of a brake on the process of European integration against the Commission and the governments. That would be a transformation in the way EU-level politics works. And although I don't like what these guys represent, that could actually be healthy for how we think about how politics plays out in Brussels.
Thanks, that's really interesting. Okay, and my question for Stefan is, I guess, more technical in a way, which is about the coordination of fiscal policy. Perhaps you could explain a bit how things have been historically and how you'd like to see that develop.
Well, fiscal policy is important because it is really the counterweight to monetary policy. And what we have is a unified monetary policy with a federal institution that works extremely well, but that has to do too much because fiscal policy is not coordinated in the counterpoint to it. And as a consequence of that, in a way, the ECB is overcharged, and we have seen this morning in the discussion already that there is a real risk that they may not have enough instruments anymore if the next recession came soon. The coordination of fiscal policy would be the right thing in order to counterbalance that. In fact, within a monetary union, what is important is the aggregate fiscal policy stance. But the aggregate fiscal policy stance is the sum of the national policy decisions, which are legitimized by national parliaments. So there's a real problem in terms of how you get the definition of an aggregate policy stance out of a decentralized and essentially independent bodies of legitimization. Now, having said that, I've done some studies with one colleague in Italy. We've just done a paper that shows that within the euro area, there is, contrary to those who are not in the euro area, there is a very strong interdependence in terms of what national fiscal policies are. So the externalities are extremely high within the single currency area, and they are not that high, or not even existing to some degree, with some of the non-euro areas. States. Now, that means fiscal policy is exactly the kind of externality that would require a European form of coordination. What is interesting also is that when you are looking at a single currency area and fiscal policy, you cannot use the traditional macroeconomic Mandel-Fleming models whereby fiscal policy has an effect on exchange rates because there is no exchange rate, there is no different currencies, it's all one currency and it's one monetary policy. But as a counterpoint of that is that you have to look at the flow of funds. And the flow of funds are between the member states' fiscal policies, but also in terms of investment and households in the different regions. And you can see that the flow of funds are strongly affected by what is going on in different member states. There are spillover effects, and then there is an aggregate effect. And these two things together are really something that needs much stronger coordination, and we have done some estimates who would be winning and who would not be winning, and it comes out that overall all member states in the euro area would have benefit in terms of the flow of funds and in terms of the business cycle, the dynamics, if fiscal policy were more strongly coordinated.
Can I, just on that, so you've got fiscal policy centrally around taxation.
But what sort of fiscal policy?
Yeah.
Fiscal policy in terms of the deficit by member states.
Oh.
Right? So in other words, you can have high taxation in Sweden and low taxation in Estonia, but what matters is the deficit impact, because that is net demand.
Right.
Okay. And so coordination that you're talking about is what? Trying to achieve a more equalized
one model I have once developed would be that you define at an aggregate level, let's say through European Parliament plus Council plus Commission, an aggregate fiscal stance that is appropriate for the given economic environment, and then allocate, maybe in proportion to GDP, this aggregate deficit to member states. And then the parliaments can decide in terms of taxation and spending how they want to accomplish that.
I see. Okay, interesting. Ambitious, yeah, good luck. I mean, that is a classic case of an economist thinking perhaps without politics, but that is our standing worry, is that politics drives in one direction and economics in another. But I think we've got some time now to open this up for some contributions from the audience. You can ask questions or you can make a comment. But if you don't mind, we'll try to keep it brief because we only have a few minutes. But we don't have mics. Is it just we'll just speak? Ah, okay.
Just a question to Stefan. What would the Karlsruhe court say about your proposal, the one that you just mentioned?
Ci vediamo. This is, we talked earlier about the need to be creative in Europe. Here you go.
Okay, good. Luck. Yeah.
Very small question to the other Simon. What are the other two structures proposed by this Greek American? Or the other two scenarios envisaged? You went through one, but not the other two.
Well, one of the scenarios was that the European Parliament would be more pro-integrationist, which is what it was observed to be at the time. The MEPs were self-selecting pro-Europeans, that therefore the European Parliament, once you increase their power in the legislative process, they'd be pulling the process of European integration and market integration faster. And the middle scenario was one where it would depend on what the political makeup of the Parliament would be. A more centre-right Parliament would giving the power to the Parliament. If it then became more politicised around a left bloc versus a right bloc, the majority in the Parliament would have a big significant effect on what then the design of the single market would look like. So you've got European Parliament dragging integration forward, European Parliament split depending on the political makeup of the Parliament, or the European Parliament being a drag against European integration.
And your claim was that the next Parliament
Parliament, for the first time, we've seen a period where it has been that middle political ground, where it depends very much on the political makeup of the Parliament, whether it was more integrationist in some areas, more pro-regulation in others, more free market in others, and so on. And I think we might now see for the first time in certain policy areas in particular, the European Parliament being a brake on the process of European integration. For example, the next European Parliament will probably have a majority that's anti-free trade.
Right, interesting. Okay, thank you. Anybody else?
I want to ask Keshwa a question.
You want to ask?
Yes.
Yeah, please do. I'd introduce her as well.
Okay, so welcome Keshwa Faulkner, who is in the House of Lords for the Lib Dem Party and dealing with European integration issues there in depth. So she's a wonderful speaker and she will talk to Europe in a moment. But I thought, as this is sort of our local London panel, I have a really burning question. You just had this fantastic success at the local elections with the Lib Dem Party, and then I see opinion polls for the European elections in the UK, and the Lib Dems are not doing well at all. Can you explain to me, poor European continental guy that I am, why it's not working in that way?
Well, there are a couple of factors, some which are historical. One is that the last local elections, the Lib Dems did really badly. They were coming out of the coalition government, were seen as untrustworthy by their traditional supporters, and they did really, really badly. So it could only get better. It wasn't going to get, well, it could have got worse, but that would have been unlikely. The other reason was that the Lib Dems, of all the pro-Remain parties, the Lib Dems are particularly guerrilla warriors on the ground. They have a long tradition, you know, the party is 100, I should say us, not they, but the party is 150 years old. It has a long tradition of being strong on local issues. Some might even say parochial issues. So they had the numbers, unlike the Brexit party or some of the other parties, to really do the groundwork over those years since we stopped being in government, 4 years. That was another factor. And I think the third factor was that traditionally, whether it was the Iraq War or previous economic cycles, the Lib Dems have attracted a protest vote. Whenever voters are fed up of one or the other, they know that the Lib Dems govern reasonably well at local level, and they trust them at local level. They're used to seeing them govern at local level. So I think those were the factors that resulted in the Lib Dems doing so well. That isn't the national picture. It's a local picture. And I think that nationally, to even have ended up in double figures, which is where I think we are now, 10 or 11%, is a big breakthrough because since 2015, we've actually been in single figures. So, but there isn't a pattern that can be replicated across to the European elections. Although, of course, the die-hard pro-Europeans are being exhorted in the media, Timothy Garton-Ash not least, for people to vote for the Lib Dems rather than any of the other Brexit parties because people see them as having the capability to deliver, again, because they're an established party.
Interesting. Thank you very much for that. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to some of these local UK issues too later. I can see all over Europe the things are breaking up, and probably we should do the same. We're hitting 11 o'clock and we've got an 11 o'clock discussion going straight in. So,
are you going to attempt a synthesis, Simon?
No. I mean, actually, I said at the beginning that there isn't one. I think it's actually a really interesting situation. The tension that exists inside the European project, as I said at the beginning, is irreducible, ineliminable, and I think Simon was very helpful to see that the history of the development of the project has also been one of periods of stabilisation, producing its own or coming into events which produce instability. And that you have then another effort at stabilisation. And I think that that's what the pattern will always be in a certain way, that there isn't a thesis, antithesis and synthesis third term here. There's no emergent reality, as it were, which would transcend both nation and international.
What about republicanism?
Well, well, the Republican state, which is more or less what we call now a liberal democratic state, is something like a reality in the nation states of Europe. The idea that we could have a great republic in the middle, in which the old nation states would become like implementing authorities, I think that is a fantasy. But that's my view. Okay, so let's thank our panelists. Thank you very much.
See you later.
Yeah.
Ich habe noch eine Verpflichtung zu erfüllen. Dann müssen wir nochmal einen Sprung geben. Okay, gut. Sie hat nämlich Geburtstag heute.
Sina. It was.
Dankeschön. Danke.
Tschüss, Herr Merz. Auf Wiedersehen, Herr Gerke.
Hello, everybody. I was saying it was great to listen to Gesine speaking in German with Beethoven behind. It was a great moment. Thank you very much for joining. Hello, Marike. Hello, Gesine. Hello, Kishver. I would like first to start this discussion by thanking Pervenche for delivering the keynote speech on this session. She started with a very interesting history thing, and it's going to be important to understand each other now to have this in mind. And then she finished with the ESA review, and that was one of the main topics of our French discussion here. The subject is extremely large, actually, so you can deal with it from a very technical and financial perspective, or you can deal with it with more political questions. So as I said, here in Paris, we stayed in our comfort zone. I must confess that with you, dear panelists, I'm going to have to step aside because some of the issues you are specialists of are not necessarily familiar for me. Let me introduce in London Lady Faulkner. Kishver is a member of the House of Lords, chairman of the EU subcommittee on financial affairs. She was born in Pakistan, but she has plenty of links in Europe. She lives in London. She has plenty of links in Europe, in Germany, in Italy, in France. In Germany, more personal links. And I would like to, I mentioned it for my French colleagues this morning. That's very nice to have London in these discussions. First, because you are still in the EU, so that's the good news. And second, as I was saying to my French colleagues this morning, to speak of finance and economy in Europe without London would be like doing a Champions League without a London club, or a European League without a London club, and that would be a pity. In Frankfurt, Dr. Gesine Schwan, and you are, Doctor, the person who will be the most difficult for me, because you are going to speak of your projects at your NGO, the project which concern refugees. So it's not necessarily a topic we are familiar with. Gesine, you accepted to speak in English, despite you perfectly speak French. And in Amsterdam, Marike, with the chief economist of ING, and I hope, Marike, you will forgive my reference to Champions League at the beginning of this discussion. Marike will bring us her Dutch realistic vision on what should be the priorities of Europe and keeping in mind this question of subsidiarity versus more integration.
I will try, Laurent.
If you agree, before talking with Gesine, we will have to leave us during the discussion. Before talking with Gesine, I would have a preliminary question to Kishver, which I think could be a good introduction to our discussion. Before the referendum, as you all remember, David Cameron obtained the removal for the UK of our 60-year-old agenda of ever closer union. Could you help us, Kishver, to understand why this question was so sensitive in your country and the link you make between this question, this issue, and our discussion of today?
Thank you very much, Laurent. Yes, it's a esoteric issue, this one, about ever closer union, but it overshadows, I think, a lot of the discussion of where power lies across EU countries, actually. And you've mentioned my various other EU connections, Italy, Germany. I see the same discussion, not framed the same way, but the same discussion taking place. Where power lies. When the treaties started with the desire to have ever closer union of the peoples of Europe, in the context of the aftermath of the war, that seemed entirely, yes, a little idealistic, but entirely an objective that we had to move towards. But I don't think the wording of that question, it wasn't calling for fraternal sentiments. You're French, you will know what I mean about fraternité, égalité, so on. It wasn't calling for fraternal sentiments. The end result of calling for an ever closer union is a union, a country, a super union perhaps, but a country. And I think here profoundly the United Kingdom, which had been a union, a very close union of its 4 countries till 25 years ago, was moving in the other direction in more recent times. So we realized that in order to preserve our union, we had to give away power to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And while we did that, it's the 20th anniversary this year of doing that, while we did that, the treaties, the Constitutional Convention and then eventually Lisbon, were moving towards the unification, the unity of Europe in a rule-making legislative framework. So this wasn't fraternal links between people, it was cast in iron, law-making, court of justice, moving towards a framework. And there were some profound questions post-Lisbon, or leading up to Lisbon, about democratic accountability. Now, where that links into what you're talking about today, integration versus subsidiarity, if you're wanting subsidiarity, then the concept of subsidiarity is that each act should be done at the appropriate level. That I remember many years ago when the discussion first started in the late 90s, that each act should be done as close to the local level of accountability as possible. But the profound question is, which was never answered when the concept was first enunciated in the treaties, of who makes the decision about the appropriate level. And if it's a technocratic decision taken in a remote place, when you have within the national member states politicians standing up year after year and saying, that happened or that happened, I can't do anything about it because it comes from the EU, and 55% of our laws come from the EU, then subsidiarity seems extremely thin as a concept. People don't feel it. People don't see. Subsidiarity has to employ an element of power and accountability, and that doesn't seem to exist. So it seemed to me that David Cameron's negotiation, the 4 points that he achieved, this was actually quite profound. It wasn't really commented upon at the time, but what it was a marker to say we had gone this far in terms of integration, and we would go no further. I should also remind your audience of something they may not know, but prior to that negotiation, the United Kingdom Parliament had passed an act of Parliament to say that the next time there was going to be treaty change in the EU that involved any change in the powers between the member states and the EU, that there would have to be a referendum. This was the European Union Referendum Act of 2011. So the mood in the UK, in all political parties, that was passed in the House of Commons during the coalition government, the mood in all political parties was an acceptance that we had gone as far as we could to integrate, that we had reached the limit of integration. And hence, Cameron came away claiming this had been a success, that we wouldn't be bound by future integration. And that was the significance of that particular negotiation.
Thank you. We will come back maybe to this point later on. I would like to switch to Gesine because she will have to leave earlier to take a flight, I guess. Gesine, when we talk together, so you chair an NGO which makes very different things from what I understood. One of them being to work on a project for integration of refugees in Germany. And so, as I said in my introduction, I must confess it's not a subject we are necessarily familiar with. But when we talk together, you were saying that for you, it was European Union which was at stake on this issue of refugees, and that you consider that if we were unable to solve this question, which is more sensitive in Germany probably than in France, that if we are unable to solve this issue, we would not go further in European integration. Could you explain us that, and then to elaborate a little bit on what you do with your NGO and this project?
Very much so. Thank you very much. And I would like very tightly to connect to what Mrs. Baroness Faulkner has just said, because as I got her, she saw a clear tension between European integration and power of people and democracy. This is a main problem, and I think this is not only true for Great Britain. This is also true for other countries. It is not true that subsidiarity, which is only understood on the level of national states, really brings power or control back to people. And therefore, because we have the same tension also within national democracies, that people have the impression that they don't have any more sufficient influence on their daily life, on their environment, etc. And therefore, I think that generally, in order to strengthen as well our national democracies as European democracies, and by that also strengthen integration in the sense of identification, either with the country or with the European Union, one should give much more co-participation or participation power on the level of the municipalities. I have heard from a colleague from the British Parliament that concerning refugees, one member of the Labour Party tried out to influence the municipality, I don't remember the name, in Yorkshire, which is a complicated region in English, as far as I see, for social and labour reasons. They wanted to introduce about 300 refugees to this small town of about 20,000 inhabitants. They didn't want, the people didn't want them. And then they went and talked to them and asked them, listen, we want to give you the reasons why that could also be in your interest and why that could be a good contribution to the general question of migration and refugees in our times. But we promise that you will be deciding at the end of our discussion if you want them or not. This was it was not just to explain them or to take them with them, but just to leave them the decision about that. And at the end of the day, they decided for taking the refugees. And for me, this is important. A main problem and challenge in our countries is that citizens don't feel sufficiently asked for co-determination, for participation. And if we can manage to strengthen participation on the level of municipalities in general, we can also strengthen satisfaction with democracy. And I mean by that not to replace decision-making of elected institutions, as the mayor or whatsoever of municipalities, but it is an advisory thing, a development advisory board. And what I am advising, and we have just come back from a conference of Riga, of Scandinavia, where we have everywhere the same problem. Municipalities and towns could much better integrate in a larger sense their population. And it's not only refugees, it's also poorer people, it's people with disabled people. We have a large scale of integration necessity. We can do that if we do it with an advisory multi-stakeholder board. This is a typical development constellation in development policy, which we consider always with Africa, etc. But we have also to develop in Europe. It's not just Africa or other countries. And if we install on the level of municipalities, by the invitation of the mayors, people from business, from organized civil society, and of course also municipality administration and mayors, and ask, listen, where do you want to be in 10 years? What are our interests? What are our opportunities? What are our possibilities concerning labor market, etc., and what are also our needs concerning the labor market? Then I think we could come to a much more equilibrated, fruitful result concerning integration on the social and on the political sense within the country and also with the European Union. This is what I'm pleading for.
Kishver, do you seem to have some reactions on that?
Yes.
Well, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't know you were speaking to me. Yes, I mean I quite agree with Dr. Schwan on almost everything that she said, and that's absolutely vital. The question of immigration, though, there is one other issue, and I think that one of the challenges you have with immigration in countries which have non-contributory access to benefits is that, as we have in the UK, and it's a particular problem here, but our health service, our many of the an element of housing benefits and so on, many of the things which people use when they arrive, which newcomers use when they arrive. And I should say, by the way, I'm an immigrant to the United Kingdom, so I know a little bit about this. I came here some years ago with 2 suitcases, not one, but still as a migrant. That what happens in a non-contributory system is that when you get pressure of an enlarging population, as we've had in the last 20 years here in the UK, that when you get those pressures of an enlarging population and there isn't a clear link between who is paying for what, then mythologies can fly. Mythologies like, they're taking all our houses away. The reason my daughter can't get a house is because they're taking the houses. The reason my kid is in an over-large classroom is because their kids, it's full of foreign kids now. You know, that kind of thing. And I think that's where governments need to, I think the United Kingdom government made 2 profound mistakes. One was not to have the break, to use the 7-year break when the Eastern European countries opened up, the A7 came in 2004. We had the opportunity of having a 7-year break and taking them in after that gradually. We didn't do that. We opened our doors instantly, and there were very profound consequences because Tony Blair's government expected, I remember very clearly asking questions about this, 50,000 per year. We ended up by having 150,000 and currently well over 200,000 a year. So we couldn't prepare for it. And I think the other mistake we made is that we in the UK, where everyone has access to everything based simply on universality, For example, child benefit. There's been the story about workers who come and work here, yet their children back in their countries have access to child benefit. Those things should have been based on a stricter contributory system. But we weren't allowed to do that, coming back to subsidiarity, because that was seen as discrimination. In the EU context, if we had treated, that means we would have had to do it for the whole population. To be fair to Blair, the Labour government did try to do that by having ID cards, which at least would have allowed people to prove that they were entitled to or not entitled to certain things. So the mythology could have been addressed by ID cards, not the problem itself, but the mythology at least could have been addressed by that. And Parliament failed to do that. So I think, while I completely agree with Dr. Schwan that integration has to happen from the grassroots up and has to start from local level and go up, but the state and the EU also have to understand the factors that are holding it back.
May I just give a short answer, because I totally agree with you. There are two more elements which have to be added. First of all, without justice for those who come, but for those who are already there, that won't work. And for that, I'm very much pleading for an incentive system that, first of all, it should be voluntary. Second, that the costs for integration should be replaced by the European Union, and that the municipality should get the same amount of money which the integration would cost for their own development, so that you would not have just an advantage for those who arrive, but also an advantage for those who are there. That because this is why I'm also searching for a broader term of integration. We have in Germany, and supposedly you have the same thing. We have in Germany the problem that housing, for instance, is a very, very grand problem. And if people in a municipality learn that for the refugees you will build houses, and they have waited for a low rent apartment for 5 years, this is of course a reason for resentment, and you have to avoid that. So I mean, how you technically then spell out all that is another question. But I think the EU should be the source to a large amount for investment also on the municipality level, at the participation on where the investment goes, and where it should help should be on the municipality level, but also, of course, integration in the larger sense of the word.
Could I come back just briefly on just a final thought on that? All of those things are absolutely right. You've discussed economics and you've discussed the legal frameworks. The elephant in the room is race, colour, religion, culture. That's essentially what makes integration a hurdle. That's what makes local communities resistance. Dr. Schwan, you will know that. You will know from what happened on New Year's Eve in, I think it was Cologne, 2 years ago, and the public reaction to that. You've seen the rise of the AfD in Germany. Ultimately, while everything else may be perfectly in place, but you cannot make people's values cohere and become a uniform set of values overnight. That's a process that I know, I really know it from having lived here, takes a period of time.
Maleki, before we switch to economic matters, you wanted to react?
Well, what I hear here, the examples of people, either refugees or immigrants coming to either Germany or to the UK, there's a lot of room for local politicians to actually support the local communities in receiving all those people coming in. So, for example, in the UK, if I understand it correctly, there were limited investments, for example, in the health services or in education, and that was as a consequence of this. Local people were actually suffering because of all the people coming in. If I look at Germany, of course, there are local possibilities for helping refugees get a job, but not only them, but also local people via education, for example. So I believe that what we see here, the risk is that we leave local politicians too much room to say to people, we can't help this, it's a European problem, whereas in reality there are local options to solve this and to make both the incoming people as well as the local people feel much better about this. So the risk here is that we see Europe as a scapegoat. And this has happened way too much in the last decades. And as a consequence, of course, people are very negative about Europe. But that's just a political response to things happening where politicians find it very comfortable to say, well, this was not our mistake, it's a European issue. And this was not always rightfully so. They were just blaming someone where they had the room to actually make a change themselves.
This sounds familiar in France because we had this problem during a long time. Maleki, if we switch to economic matters, because you are first an economist, Europe is not too badly positioned in terms of growth, but people have the feeling it's mainly used to deleverage and that they never see any progress in their day-to-day life. Is it the case in Netherlands first, and is it your thinking about Europe in general?
Well, what we see in the Netherlands is that we have seen nice economic growth over the last couple of years. So we've seen nice GDP numbers being presented to us. And many people are saying, well, we don't really experience this in our daily life. And we did some research here, we went into the statistics, and we actually noticed that this is not just a feeling. People really haven't experienced a lot of economic growth in the last couple of years. If we look at Dutch households, the average household is still consuming less than it was pre-crisis. And of course, this means something for people. It has an effect on their daily life. They basically really still have difficulty making ends meet. And the reason that they have this is, first of all, that we had a very heavy crisis, of course. And then secondly, we were basically both fixing the institutions. So all sorts of new regulations were being developed. In the Netherlands, we also tried to tackle the aging problem at the same time. So pension reforms were installed, healthcare reforms were started. And at the same time, we also tried to deleverage. So both households for mortgage debt, but also the government has been trying to deleverage. What this means is that we've not seen a lot of economic progress, but the progress that we've seen hasn't really ended up in basically the households. So what I believe we see currently is people say, okay, I'm part of Europe, I'm part of this capitalist system which needed fixing, which was about there was something wrong with the banks, we don't exactly understand what's going on, but it wasn't really for us, because look at what is happening to our daily financial situation. It's not improved. And of course, this makes it very difficult to make people enthusiastic about the economic benefits of Europe. And I believe this is not only the case for the Netherlands, this is also the case for many European regions, where we see that there's relatively little growth over the last couple of years, because basically the story is that we've been trying to fix institutions and we've been trying to make sure that our governments were deleveraging, which is all very wise from a long-term perspective, but very painful on the short run. And I believe this is actually not really, I mean, from an economic sense, I will say that in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, we will be happy that we did it. But on the short run perspective, we must acknowledge the fact that people have really become very angry with what the European project has meant to them in an economic sense.
Isn't it also because the financial risk management and the consequences of the financial crisis had to be dealt with also, no?
Of course. I mean, of course, this was a necessity. Yeah? So in many ways, definitely the rebuilding or the improvement of institutions was necessary, and it had to be done. And I personally believe that a lot of we were much too prone to a crisis, and there were many mechanisms which basically worsened the crisis just because the monetary union was far from complete. And it's improved, and that's very relevant for the future, because the chances of a crisis again being happening of the same magnitude as what we've seen over the last couple of years, those have been diminished very strongly. But by also deleveraging so strongly and putting so much focus on that with the whole Stability and Growth Pact, which meant very little room for fiscal policy. And of course, here in the Netherlands, we're very keen to avoid any room for fiscal policy because we really want to make sure we're a Calvinist country, so we do that at home, and we want other countries to behave the same. So the long-term effects, I believe, will be beneficial, but the short-run effects were very, very painful.
Gesine, before you leave, I don't know exactly at which time you must leave. Do you have the feeling that we share common priorities in general? That's a question I intended to raise to Marike, but I could raise it to you as well. Do you have the feeling that European people at the time of these elections share common priorities in terms of European integration?
At least I have the impression that the three women share common ideas and common understanding much more easy way than others maybe. Maybe this is my very short feminist contribution. But I think
I'm sorry to be the only man in the discussion.
No, we have also minority protection. This is also a women's endeavor. No, but the other point is, I think the experience is, as soon as you come closer to the problems and more precise, and you do not just stay on a superficial level where you throw to each other ideological terms, then you come to common values and to common understanding. I'm not so sure, I'm not an economist, but I'm not so sure if it is only the short-term consequence of the pursued economic policies which are not so good, but I do even think that the long-term consequences of that policy is not so good. The whole term of reforms has to be spelled out very clearly, because you have behind that a certain theory of the priority and kind of absolute priority of a balanced budget, and the whole question if a state and a state budget should kind of balance more in a more differentiated way what will be investments, what will be debts, etc., and credits. This is, I think, the absolute priority which especially the German government and our finance minister Schäuble has put on this idea of having a budget which is totally in balance has not been good for a number of economies. This is a kind of leveling of the very different economic situations of different countries in Europe, which hasn't been okay. But I would wish, and this is again, and I'm finishing with this kind of feminist touch, I think if we could come really closer together and really understanding what we want each other, and of course to see that if we want to go on with Europe, we cannot only keep to the national point of view, although the power source of all these governments is of course national elections. But I do even think that within the national societies there is more understanding if we argue precisely than we feel it now. So I'm pleading very much for understanding that Europe is absolutely necessary for everybody, has an advantage, but the advantages are very, very differently spread within the societies. We have to be much more just within the societies. We have to be much more balanced, and then we can also go on with European integration. And disintegrated national societies won't work to integrate Europe. That will never work. Policies can only be integrated if they work with integrated societies. This goes together very closely.
Thank you. If we come back to economy, Marike, is it the time for more government spending in Europe and in northern countries in particular?
Well, of course, I mean, the European Commission has been saying for a number of years to countries such as my country and to Germany that there's room for additional government spending. Now, I mean, it sounds kind of odd to do that in economies which already have very high employment. So basically the defense from the Netherlands has always been, we don't really need it, our economy is doing fine and we don't want to risk overheating it. But you may well say that there are reasons for investing locally also. One reason could be to make the energy transition a bit smoother, for example. And there's a lot of resistance in the Netherlands to the energy transition, not so much to the fact that it's taking place, but the fact that people fear that they will have to pay for it themselves and they can't afford it. Those households which have been suffering economically are now very reluctant to see this happen because they fear that they will really not be able to pay their energy bills. Now, the government may use the room which it has currently to spend something on that, and that for future generations it will pay off. So you don't necessarily have to spend just for the sake of spending. You may well think about, okay, so exactly what does Dutch society need currently? What are the fears of people? So, for example, the energy transition, but also we see here in the Netherlands, we were just talking about opportunities for people. We see in our educational system that equal opportunities are becoming more and more of a problem. So we have a whole lot of statistics which show that in the Netherlands, young people who are going to schools really are beginning to diverge in the sense that lower and middle educated people have children which have less opportunities than the children of higher educated people. So by investing in education, for example, you also invest in the future growth potential of your country. So I believe the Netherlands has a lot of room to, within the European framework, both make a gesture towards the European Commission and also do something which would be very helpful on the shorter and the longer run for Dutch people. So I would really welcome this way of thinking because I believe it's not only it's not just about growing GDP, it's about growing a GDP which helps people to enjoy life and be more optimistic about the future, because that's really what we lack currently. The current status of Europe is the status of a continent which is growing, but it's only growing very slowly and people don't experience progress. And if Europe is not delivering on that economic promise, it loses a bit of its credibility, I believe, and that's a shame.
Kishver, seen from London, all these debates are still in the discussions, or are you so much concerned by Brexit that you only speak of Brexit? I mean, all these questions of we are talking about in continental Europe. Do you have the same issues? How is it handled in terms of public debate? Thank you, Gesine. Bye bye. It was scheduled.
Huh? It sounds like a contradiction in terms, but some parts of the United Kingdom are consumed by Brexit. I would say that's our civil service and parts of our government. And other parts have nothing to do. If you read the newspapers this morning in the United Kingdom, you would realize that we're having another holiday in Parliament, another 11 days off. Last month we had 2 weeks off. So we go home very early. We don't work that hard because there's nothing to do. So we're extremely interested in what's happening across the water, across the English Channel. Yes, I mean, my committee is as I said, economic and financial affairs, so it has oversight of the EU budget, and of course we see very closely what's happening in the Eurozone, because whether we're in the Eurozone or not, it impacts us. So if I could pick up 1 or 2 points that Marieke Bloem made. You advocated, Ms. Bloem, very strongly that politicians should be spending more on things to do with to improve inequality and to improve social mobility. I completely agree with you. But if you're a Eurozone country, then you don't have the levers to do that, because, as you yourself acknowledged, that the fiscal tools were lost in the aftermath of the financial crisis. And if you're an Italian now, trying to cope with the pressures of just endless migration, extremely poor infrastructure, historic lack of investment and historic political instability. But if you're an Italian now and you want to spend money on, not least on having garbage collected in Rome, never mind anything else, you can't do that. You can't do that because you're breaching the budget rules of the Eurozone. So that, it is, although we're not in the Eurozone, we see very clearly the arguments going on in the Eurozone. And very interestingly, our main opposition party sees the EU as a neoliberal project. A neoliberal project because the straitjacket, the rules are so tight that it doesn't allow for, I think you described this as local decision-making. I don't call it local, I call it member states. It's not local. Local implies very small. Member states are still the controllers of what happens in the EU. Maybe not for long, but they still are. But it doesn't allow member states the leverage that they need to do the things that they need. To stabilize the Eurozone, you need a deposit guarantee scheme. Well, we know how Mr. Schäuble felt about that in Germany not so long ago. And I don't see Mr. Scholz running to do it either. So I think the profound and fundamental problem is that outright monetary transactions have reduced the ability of savers to get any return on their capital. The rules on TLAC and MREL have made it pretty difficult for institutions like banks to make any money. Perhaps our chairman would have some sympathy with that. You have non-performing loans across many countries. You see the big investment firms in the EU under quite a lot of pressure and stress. And then we have so that you have all of these problems that are inherent in the Eurozone. And then you have Mr. Trump and Mr. Xi Jinping and the rise of protectionism. If you look at global trade figures of the last 3 or 4 years, global trade is actually declining. It's not increasing on the trajectory it should have. If you see the biggest IPOs, they're happening in East Asia. They're not happening in Europe. Europe is actually in a very weak place globally in terms of its preparedness for the future of work, the future of technology, and it's in a very poor place in its preparedness for what happens if there is another crash, which I'm quite worried about.
Well, if I would say that the current concern, of course, but we can never be entirely sure that if a crisis would hit, we wouldn't suffer from it. But I would say that the crisis response mechanisms have really improved a lot over the last couple of years. What I agree with is the fact that many of our services markets, be it energy, telecommunications, digital services, or banking, are still very fragmented. And this makes it very difficult for companies to actually benefit from the enormous scale that the European market in theory has to offer to them. So one of the things that was a recurring theme here this morning in the Netherlands is that we would actually say that, you were saying that integration has gone too far from a UK perspective, but we would say that in many respects the European integration has not gone far enough for companies to actually be able to benefit from that European market. And we don't necessarily want companies to benefit from that European market. The reason why we want that is because we all here in the room believe that if we have a European banking market, if we have a European telecoms market, if we have a European digital market, then in the end, we as consumers can all benefit from that very strongly. So if you are looking at what the European Union needs to work with in the next decade or so, we would say here in the Netherlands, please open up these markets. Please make sure that regulation in the various markets is similar so that companies can actually compete and in that way offer better services to consumers at a lower price. This is possible for Europe, but the whole problem is that it also means that local politicians have to make compromises. And one of the things I must admit as being a Dutch person is that we see that our own politicians, when they go into Europe, they actually are very, very reluctant to make any compromises. And what they seem to be telling in that political debate is that they can't really sell any of these compromises back at home. So be it about the Stability and Growth Pact, about the fiscal discipline, but also about any other measure. Our politicians go into Europe explaining to Europe that the whole of Europe has to become as the Netherlands is. And the interesting thing is that if you look at basically polls where people are being asked how they feel about Europe, I don't believe that the Dutch people are as Euro-critical as our Dutch politicians are. So one of the things we were saying here this morning is that it seems to be that our Dutch politicians seem to be less eager about Europe than Dutch voters are. And maybe 2 years ago, Dutch voters weren't so optimistic about Europe, but this has really changed with the changing environment, with the position of the US, with China, also with the dealing with Brexit. People have become much more pro-European here in the Netherlands, and I believe, therefore, our Dutch politicians at least should take the room to begin with opening up these markets, but also laying the foundation for future growth, because I believe that Dutch people at least are ready to begin compromising.
The problem, Marika, is also a question of horizon, which is that the points you mentioned in terms of better integration of financial markets or whatever, or banking markets, would have positive effects for citizens, but in a long term or in a mid-term perspective.
That's true. That's also one of the things we were saying. I mean, as an economist, of course, I love the whole idea of creative destruction. So what I want to happen is companies compete with each other, some win, some lose, and in the end, as a consumer, I benefit, and that means that also as a worker, I benefit, because I will be more productive, I will earn a higher wage, and I will be able to afford more. However, this simple story, which I as an economist can tell, on the short run, it also means that there will be people losing. And one of the things that my profession in the past has not really acknowledged is that maybe on average people gain, but there are losers of this whole system of economic progress. And we know from psychology that people who are losing actually experience that loss much more emotionally than people will be experiencing what they gain. So there are all sorts of experiments where basically if you have one person winning €1 and one person losing €1, then overall they will be less happy than they were before, because that one person who's lost €1 is much more unhappy than that one person who won €1. And this is one of the fundamental issues, I believe, in progress, which also on the short run means losers, as you were saying, for politicians to explain that to people, that in the longer run this will pay off. That will be very difficult. One thing about that, though, Europeans tend to speak about this in very, very technical, formal language. So one of the things I would really, really be happy to see is if people would not be so much speaking about something like banking union or capital markets union. It's very difficult for people to understand that. What we want to happen is that the best companies can get the best access to finance, and then they can produce the best things for us. And this all, it's very basic, but it needs to be explained a lot better, that we're not doing banking union because banks are benefiting from it, or capital markets union because companies are benefiting from it, but we're doing it because that's what we believe will be best for people.
I knew that it would be a very open debate. I didn't think we would finish with psychology or things like that, but that's not surprising. Kishore, you wanted to add something?
Yes, I wanted to add many, many things. One of which is, I'm afraid that as the only politician in the room, from what I can tell, I'm not a local politician. I'm a national politician. So just let me make that point. Coming to competition, Capital Markets Union, the biggest capital market is in the US, in the world. The biggest global capital market is the US. Second biggest capital market is the United Kingdom. So, you know, it's very well to want certain things to happen in Europe, quite necessarily, and I agree completely with Marika Bloom here, that Eurozone, an optimal currency areas integration is not yet in place. And you're not going to get the benefits of an optimal currency union until all of the architecture is in place. So it's easy to blame politicians and to say they can't explain to people that the longer term will benefit them. The democratic cycle in most of these countries that we're talking about in the EU is between 4 and 5 years. You get your exams at the end of either 4 or 5 years, you pass or you fail. It is very hard to say to your examiner, the public, give me another 15 years and I'll fix it for you. People aren't there. One of the issues with democratic accountability that I was referring to earlier, and the rule of technocrats, is that if a politician signs up to a treaty change, let's take Lisbon as an example, he's gone 1 year later. He's not there to offer an explanation of why he did that. He might have promised a referendum or not. It's the next lot who have to explain what happened and why power has gone away from them and gone somewhere else, and why they have to stand up when stuff happens that people in their country don't like. They have to say, it wasn't me, Gov, it was somebody else. I know that the ideal of European integration is ruled by technocrats. That is the ideal. If you can get your populations to sign up to that, bravo to you. I know that we can't here in the UK, and nor in half a dozen other European countries that I know well. But let me say to you about the Netherlands, and let me defend your government a little bit. You only need to look as far back as the Ukraine referendum you had. The referendum was about something very particular to do with assistance for Ukraine. It got hijacked by anti-EU people. So Mr. Rutte, poor Mr. Rutte, maybe not poor, very nice Mr. Rutte, but Mr. Rutte has to look over his shoulder because you had Geert Wilders. You have had a rise of anti-EU parties in the Netherlands, just like everywhere else in Europe. Actually, I find it one of the unique things about the United Kingdom is that we don't get the Front National, we don't get the AfD, we don't get those kind of parties here. Touch wood, as yet. But we will do that if the politicians do what you're encouraging us to do, which is ignore the will of the people and ignore democratic accountability.
Yeah. I don't know whether it's a conclusion. Marike, I let you answer.
Well, one of the interesting things, I actually went to visit the UK 2 years ago because people were beginning to think that Nexit would be the next thing after Brexit in the 2017 elections, where the Freedom Party was expected to win. And then one of the interesting things I experienced there is that, of course, the UK perspective on Europe is so entirely different. So I understand what you're saying about taking voters with you and making sure that this is not just a technocratic story. But it's also good to realize that the Netherlands is, in essence, a very European country. And people in the Netherlands are very aware of the fact that we really, really benefit a lot from European Union. We're very small, we're a traders nation, we're a transport nation, we're a hub to Europe, and everyone here is basically raised to be aware of the fact that we benefit so much from European Union. So one of the things I'm referring to is there have been a lot of polls in the Netherlands over the last couple of weeks, of course, with the European elections coming up. And they actually turned out to be quite pro-European. So if you ask people, for example, would they consider an exit a positive thing, depending on which poll you pick, it's either 8 or 12% of the people, Dutch people, who would support that. So what I'm seeing is that, yes, about 2 years ago, people were more critical of the European Union and of the Eurozone, but that's really changed over the last couple of years. And what's interesting is that it seems that our politicians are currently really in a different position from where the people are. So it's as if they are still doing the elections of 2 years ago in the way they are approaching any European subject, rather than looking at what people experience currently. And basically the last couple of years for many Dutch people, I believe, have really been kind of a new way of looking at Europe and a much more positive way than what used to be the case about 2 years ago. That basically having common enemies has really made a difference here. So I understand where you are coming from, and I agree that we don't see this happening in the UK, but we've really seen a change here in the Netherlands. But politicians seem to be reluctant or maybe not aware of what's going on here.
Every time we talk together on these issues, we understand why we had the Brexit. Thank you very much for this open discussion. I hope it answered your what you were waiting for in the subject, and I wish you a good rest of the day. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you, Laurent.
Thank you.